Now, this is where we are starting to talk about the first, and if not the second, of the two thresholds that we're not even going to refer to that terminology. We're just simply going to drop that terminology. But nevertheless, we want to say there's two things to get in mind. Here's one of them. Three perspectives on communication. There's transfer of communication, control of communication, but there's also an approach to communication that's about dialogue. Now, this is what we're going to cover off, and I've made a highlight here for you and for us that in the original package we were going to work with a tiny little case study. We're not too convinced about that yet. There may be another one we want to bring in. Here's the next one. You still there?
Yep.
Okay, so the conventional approach to communication looks like this. You know, it's a transfer of information. And everybody that's done any communication would recognize this model straight away. It's sending a message. The way we talk, the way we intend when we say we're going to communicate, we really mean more often than not, we mean we're going to send you something. So it looks like this, and you get that standard stuff about, you know, interference and people not quite understanding it perhaps. So there's issues about understanding what's required for effective information transfer. Well, that's one. But the things that we need to be getting our heads around are, well, we're going to ask some questions. How does the sender communicate as clearly as possible so that the receiver gets it? And that means you've got to start thinking through carefully some of the basics about, you know, understandable language, understandable context, not too complex, pretty simple examples, and repeating the kind of message you're trying to get across, maybe in other words. So it's a simplified approach. Some would say simplistic, but simplified. Now we pause and we say, what can we see if we go through this process? And almost everything we've done is going to be simply about transfer. We're going to get this message across. What do you see as being the weaknesses? So it's time to think about what those kind of things might be. And then we prompt into some issues. What weaknesses does come across if you start thinking about the attitudes and behaviours may not change just because people understand what's going on. It doesn't mean they're going to change what they're going to do or even the way they think. And they've got different mental processes. Some people favour a scientific approach. Some people favour a logical approach. Some people favour a physical approach. Some people want to contemplate. So it doesn't always mean we have the same ways of interpreting things. And if you're expecting everybody to interpret the world as you do, then there's going to be a big gap between the extent to which it's understood. So we have to find ways to engage them, not just with verbal activity, but the non-verbal. Now, this brings us very, very close to what we're trying to do online. Much of what we're doing is somebody speaking and other people are listening, but we don't always see each other. And particularly when we've got these boxes on where we can't see people's faces, this makes it really difficult. So these are some of the issues for us to grapple with and trying to understand how is the idea being received? How is it being interpreted? The second form of approach here is where it's used to gain an influence over others. And there's a lot of stuff here. This is called strategic control. Now, they're not the words that will be used. The words that will be used will be persuasion and issues about getting results where you will win. But the intention is to control people's actions, to get them to do things as you want them to do. So what can go wrong there? What do you think would be some of the issues there? Well, when we begin down that track, we can start to see that there's a particular meaning somebody might have in mind about how they're going to approach a problem, how we're going to solve an issue. And they want everybody to be on board with that same level. And they'll use language of the kind of, are you with me or against me? Are we on the bus on the same hymn page? All that stuff. It's all about, you've got to be understanding where we're heading, and it's got to be where I want you to head. So it's what I want you to do. So these are issues of control. And the third example here is another one which comes closer to where we want to be. And this one's about dialogue. Now, the important word there is dialogue because it's got Greek roots. Dia comes from the Greek word meaning to share, and logic comes from the Greek word logos, which means to understand. So dialogue means shared understanding. Now, this is really quite a crucial insight, because it means that what I might say may not be interpreted by you for the whole reasons we've discussed briefly, under control and under transactional approaches. You might have a different background, and in terms of science, in terms of physics, in terms of industry, in terms of upbringing and culture, religion, where your frames of interpreting might be completely different to mine, let alone different to others. So we have to find a way to start to think about what might be involved in this larger, complex, more appropriate ways of thinking. And it means that we then start to think about, well, it's not just different interpretations. There are going to be different values, different interpretations based on different perspectives. And these will, in often cases, be a source of conflict. People are going to differ about what it is we're aiming for. They're going to differ about the way we want to approach it. There's going to be conflict, therefore there's not going to be agreement. Now that's called dissensus. And we romance ideas of consensus, are you with me? But we have to start to think about, well, what would it take for people to be with me? And part of the answer we want to explore through this subject is, well, how can we find ways to enable people to critique and question, maybe to differ, ideally to differ. And that differing process is called dissensus. So we might find ourselves saying, well, we can't have too much outcomes of consensus unless we've had substantial dissensus. So we're going to factor in here some kind of experience that will enable them to see what we're getting at. We've got one in mind that's not too bad. It's a little bit dated and a little bit complex, more complex perhaps at first than we might have. So we're going to talk to Yona and amongst ourselves briefly to find is there an alternative that maybe an activity that we could use, but that's going to come in there. And then we try to find a way to pull this together by saying, well, now many people may be familiar with the age-old story of the blind people stumbling through the jungle and coming upon an open space, and they hit this very large elephant, but they don't know it's an elephant. They're coming at it from different perspectives and they're blind. So somebody's grabbing the tail. They say, oh, I've got some rope here. Other people are grabbing hold of with one of the legs and they say, I'm standing next to a tree. It's a very hairy tree. Somebody's saying, well, I've found a leaf. I'm playing around with this thing and waving around. It's a very big hairy leaf. Now, the point of this exercise is to realize that it's not until we start talking to each other and start understanding what each of us is seeing that the blindfold starts to drop. The blindfold is often our prejudices, our biases, the only things we see, the only frames we have. Once we've started to drop those and see what other people are seeing, it's only then do we realize that actually we've got talking here is something where there's some things in common. And actually not talking about a leg, nor a rope, nor a leaf. It's, in fact, something substantial. It's an elephant. Ancient tale. So the subject invites you to ask these kind of questions. What would it take in terms of dialogue to transform an organization? So when we start talking about what are we trying to achieve through communication, we'll find ourselves discussing at an organizational level objectives, finding ways to think about what it is we're striving for. And then we have to start to think about ways in which we can contribute. There's going to be not simply getting what we want, being efficient and productive, but also ways that are genuinely in terms of consistency about people's well-being, they're healthy, but also consistently responsible in terms of ethical and moral standards about how we go about doing it. Therefore, we will expose questions of deception and ideas of deceit, but start to respect people's need for a fuller account, a much more detailed account, and a more open book approach, perhaps. So that's our kind of intro. That's what's ahead. They're the sorts of things we would seek to set up